We're going to hear this week from Richard Bacon. This is the second of 2 weeks in which Richard Bacon, who's the MP for Norfolk South, not South, isn't it? I correct myself every time again. And who is a senior member, of, as I said last week, of the Public Accounts Committee, and has been previously members of other select committees, a member of other select committees. And he's going to talk to us this week rather more about PAC select committees, but particularly about the things that might be done to improve the quality of accountability and the way in which Parliament holds the executive to account. Richard.
Tony, thank you very much, and it's great to be back. Last time I started by talking more broadly about the issues of financial accountability and how Parliament got control of the executive by getting control of finance, how the executive in response essentially made itself a subset of the legislature, of Parliament, in order to control it. And I talked more broadly about the growing role of select committees, and I touched on the National Audit Office. I'm going to start today by talking a little more about the National Audit Office and some of the broader themes that arise from the scrutiny process involving the National Audit Office and our committee, the Public Accounts Committee, through which the National Audit Office reports to Parliament, and also a little about other select committees, and then talk more broadly about the themes of scrutiny and the attempts to improve not just scrutiny, but how government works. I thought, though, I would start, mainly for a technological reason. Last time I seem to remember it blew up. I would just show you, before I go any further, something on my website. This is the front page of my website, richardbacon.org.uk. You will see here, I hope it's visible, yes, here on my left, my right as you're looking at me, I've handily put, they're not just for LSE students, I mean anybody can look at them, but here they are. I'll keep looking this way, it's probably easier. This is the reading list, and I've added in, on here, hot links to all the items which you might want to take a look at should you wish to explore the themes further. I recommended these two before, the Hansard Society ones. A whole load of parliamentary reports here. I've just added a couple more on. This one, Politics and Administration, which I can even show you using this amazing camera. That one there, it was the third report of 2006-07 from the Public Administration Committee when Tony Wright, who's already spoken in this series, addressed you. And then another one called Good Government, the 8th report of 2008-09. Actually, I'll move them slightly so you can see the HC number at the bottom. HC 97, whoops, HC 97 volume 1, that means down at the bottom there. And this one is HC 122 volume 1, although in this one it's worth knowing that there's a very good volume 2, which is a verbatim transcript that's worth looking at. And I'll mention those again slightly later if I have time. But I thought it would be worth just drawing your attention to this reading list. In fact, it's very easy to go and look at it all because I've stuck it all in one place, as well as the various bits of reading material there. And while I'm on the subject, I thought I would let you into a secret, which is that if you have to be on the front page of my website in order to do this. If you press in the middle of Big Ben, you get all this. And if you then, this is just my background dump, basically, of stuff that I use, and none of it's confidential, but it's all just stuff that I like having access to. Here was what I called the library when I originally was doing background stuff for the book. And in here, this one called Civil Servants, there is a very large dump of stuff. Most of this is, nearly all of this is not hot links to where it was, it's onto the hard drive of my own website, so it's all in one place. And so if you want to go a lot further, there's a lot to scroll through and look at here. Some of it's think tanks, the Institute for Government, I've got a lot of stuff there. Some of it's Institute for Public Policy Research, Reform, the Reform think tank, Demos, another think tank, all of it related to these subjects. And although there's a lot there, I would be the first person to say this is not comprehensive. But while I was at it, I thought I'd draw your attention to two particular documents which I found fascinating and which I wrestled with for a long time and which I draw attention to in the latter chapters of my own book. The first one is this one from Reform, The Reluctant Managers, which is a critique by a writer called Rupert Darwell, who's worked in the city and as a special advisor in Whitehall. one of the most clearly written and devastating critiques of the civil service I think I've read anywhere. It's beautifully written. It's just enjoyable to read. And this other one, which is very, very similar in the themes that it deals with. For some reason, there are two versions of it here. Whitehall's Black Box, Accountability and Performance in the Senior Civil Service. This is rather longer and is from the left-leaning IPPR. The Reform think tank obviously is slightly more right-leaning, but they very much tread on the same territory and talk about the failure of civil service reform and accountability and propose solutions, both of which, and I don't think I really talked about this last time, there wasn't time to do so, but both of which dwell to some extent at some length on the issues of ministerial responsibility, and both say that the removal of ministerial responsibility from ministers so that they can concentrate on, as it were, strategic issues and leave the implementation to others, to civil servants and to people in executive agencies. They both come essentially to that conclusion. And I wrestled with both of these for a long time, both partly because they're so well written and so enticing, partly because there is an awful lot to answer for. There has been so much that has gone so wrong, and they are very seductive and I think ultimately oversimple solutions. And I go into that subject at some length in the latter chapters of my book in the chapters on civil servants and on ministers. But right now, so I just wanted to flag that up while we still have contact, as it were, I'll just, if you want to listen to my views on the ambulance trust on the local radio station, you can do that as well, but I honestly don't recommend it. I thought I'd sort of pick up where I left off and talk a little bit more about some of the reports that we have looked at. This is very, very much skating over the territory, and it's just a small example of a small subset of possible really good examples of a much larger universe, because, as I mentioned last time, we do on our committee 2 reports per week. The National Audit Office publishes between 50 to 60 reports a year that are intended for parliamentary hearings, in addition to all the other work and memoranda that it does that aren't necessarily for parliamentary consumption and may indeed be for consumption inside government, almost as a form of consultancy. But just among the 50 to 60 that we do each year, since 2001, therefore I've done probably about 600 or so, I don't know exactly. I know I've done 62 on PFI because I counted it, or I've got a log where they're stored, which was quite an alarming find when I realised I'd marinated in PFI for longer and on a wider range of subjects than some of the people who do PFI for a living. But just to give you a few examples, years ago, I hadn't been long on the committee, we looked at the National Probation Service Information Systems Strategy, and I don't recommend you're trying to say that when you're drunk. This was basically a computer system for the probation service. And they had 7 project managers in 7 years, 5 of whom knew nothing about project management. It ran hundreds of millions of pounds over budget, and eventually it got cancelled. We looked at the National Programme for IT and the Health Service, known as NP-FIT, or sometimes as the NHS computer, as if there aren't any other NHS computers other than the ones in NP-FIT. But we did look at that at length, and because it started a long time ago, and because I happen to have some very good computer journalist contacts who drew my attention to it very early on, and they introduced me to other people who turned out to be very good sources, I ended up following it in inordinate detail. There's a whole chapter in the book about it, and the reason I got involved with it was not because of some sort of unfortunate childhood experiences with hospital computers and my need to work out my issues, but simply because it was such a large amount of money, and the projected amount varied wildly. When first the what was called the project profile model was written, they estimated that it would be 5 billion. When they announced that they were going to do it and published it, it suddenly dropped to 2.3 billion, then it went up to 6 billion, then it went up to 12 billion, 12.7 billion, then down again. A few years in, the then Health Secretary said that it was essential for the front line. There were parts of the NHS that couldn't operate without it. And then the following day, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer said on television that it wasn't essential for the front line. He was announcing a cut of £600 million. It's rather like in the thick of it, where you go into the television studio and you find out that you have quite a lot less than you thought you had, or that it's going to be used for something else. But the central issue was that the government signed up to a whole set of very large contracts with big prime contractors before they decided what it was that they wanted to buy, and without the suppliers, the computer companies and the software services companies, having any idea what it was that they were expected to supply, and thus set in stone a set of contractual arrangements which would not deliver what it was that they wanted once they decided what it was that they wanted, by which time, of course, it was too late, and ended up in such a contractually weak position that they had to keep paying the contractor, and the thing is still going on now. They're trying to dismantle it. This was something that started, the contract letting process started in 2002 and was finished in its first phase by October 2003, but I mean, it's still dragging on. And the last time we looked at it, just one contractor who'd been supposed to get $1 billion to start with, then bought two of the other contracts when Accenture pulled out, realizing it was the best thing to cut their losses, which were by then $450 million. So this other contractor, CSC, took on Accenture's contracts, and then it was $3.1 billion, and as a reward for complete non-delivery, or not complete, but nearly complete non-delivery, the last time we looked at it, the money involved had gone up to $3.7 billion, and that was just for that one contractor. But because, and this is a central problem in the way the government goes about negotiating and managing computer contracts, the supply side, the sell side, is much better at managing the documentation of what it has been agreed will be done. So later, if they ever get to the point where they might end up in court, if the government were to say, and this applies across the piece to every government department practically, if the government were ever to say, well, this is dreadful, you haven't done X, Y, and Z, the contractor will cite chapter and verse in saying, well, that's true, we haven't done X, Y, and Z, but that's because you haven't done A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And here are the dates and the documents when you said that you would do those things. And because they tend to be much better at keeping records than the public sector contractors, whose people move around, the public sector in-house buyers, who tend to be at a fairly junior level too often, and who don't often have the same level of skill as the private sector suppliers, and who move around a lot, because they tend to keep much better records in the private sector. When they get to these sorts of problems, the government then goes off and concerts my learned friends around the corner here in Lincoln's Inn or elsewhere. They spend a few £1,000s per hour on QCs for a few hours, and then they are told, well, you can go to court if you want, but you'll probably lose, and here's why. And so from a very weak contractual position, and that's just one example, but again, it's happened elsewhere, they're having to keep paying the contractor to try and do something and then figure out something that they want done, because the alternative could be to end up paying the contractor for the entire value of the contract in order to get absolutely nothing done. The foreign national prisoners scandal happened some years ago, and a Home Secretary had to resign as a result of it. And this was because the management of the asylum system was so poor that when you had a failed asylum applicant, and that's to say someone who'd been right through the process, been through every stage of the process, and was definitely what in the jargon was called a failed asylum applicant, there was no further recourse other than to be deported. When such a person happened to have committed a crime and thus had to spend time in prison, when they were let out, you might have thought that the prison service and the Immigration and Nationality Directorate would talk to each other, and the prison service would pick up the phone and say, we've got this prisoner here who's a failed asylum applicant and who now has finished his prison term and needs to be deported. Well, the prison service did do that. Unfortunately, nobody picked up the phone to answer it at the other end because it would have made the numbers look bad. So what happened was that people who had committed very, very serious crimes, including murder and rape and arson and kidnap, and who were, at the end of their sentences, were released into the community, even though everyone knew they had absolutely no legal basis to remain in the country at all. And this went on for quite a long time until it was exposed. And there's, by the way, there's a chapter in the book about that. The passport agency is an interesting one because it started many, many years ago in the 80s, really. But once exchange controls ended in 1979, it was almost Mrs. Thatcher's first act as Prime Minister was to tell the Bank of England to remove exchange controls so that people could buy and sell currency as much as they wanted. I mean, it's hard to believe now. When I grew up as a teenager in the 1970s, not that I ever had £50 as a teenager, I don't think, but the limit that you could take out of the country was £50. And if you wanted to do more than that, you had to go through a complicated application process and have it stamped in your passport. Because at the time the balance of payments crisis was always the big headline that hit the headlines on the news. And it's strange now how we run an enormous trade deficit without anyone seeming to blink. But at the time this was a big thing. And when it finally went, and when cheap air travel started to come in and charter airlines started to spring up all over the place, there evolved a level of travel that people just hadn't been able to experience before, and thus the demand for passports was much, much higher. And the governments of the day could see this as a growing problem in the 80s, and by 1989 they decided they had to do something about it. And this was under, obviously, the then Thatcher government. By 1991 they had a real serious push on it and didn't make serious progress. The government changed office in 97. They had another go, but for a variety of reasons it went horribly wrong. And by 1999 there were enormous queues outside the passport office in Petit France, just around the corner from St James's Park and St James's Park Tube Station, where the then Home Office was, now the Ministry of Justice. Just opposite there where the passport offices were, because they had changed the rules. The agency had changed the rules so that people under 16 had to have their own passport rather than travelling on their parents' passport, which one had hitherto been allowed to do, but because of issues around child abduction had been decided was no longer a good idea. But they ignored their own rules, or put it this way, they forgot about them when they were trying to figure out what kind of setup they would need for issuing passports, as a result of which they were completely overwhelmed. And it was a great media fest for the gawping newspapers and television, because one of the people who's unable to get a passport in this country and unable to get citizenship, although he has the right to remain, is Mohammed Al-Fayed, owner of Harrods. And as this queue developed around the block for half a mile or a mile, not only did they have Anne Widdecombe, who was then Shadow Home Secretary, coming and lending them tea and sympathy, which was obviously a fairly overwhelming experience in itself for many of them. They then also had Mohammed Al-Fayed with his delivery van from Harrods Food Hall, giving them food to keep them going during the many hours that they were waiting, with harassed officials handing out umbrellas and luncheon vouchers, which really weren't obviously competing with Harrods Food Hall. And so I could go on. I mean, there are many, many examples. Perhaps the most extraordinary in many ways, for the sheer scale of the baroque scale of the mistakes, was the Rural Payments Agency. This was an agency set up really for one purpose, and that was to deal with the consequences of the reforms to the Common Agricultural Policy and the need to make payments to farmers, which were to be on a series of different bases from the way that they had been in the past. And without going into enormous detail about the various different bases, essentially they were to be paid not for production as they'd been done in the past, which had led to all the then famous butter mountains and wine lakes, but rather for the amount of land that they farmed, with various different formulae thrown in depending upon what they did to enhance the environment. But the long and short of it was that of the various systems that you could adopt, the government chose the most complicated system that was available, of all the available systems, chose to administer it in the shortest of all the available timetables, in a way that was certain to increase both the total number of claimants and the total land area claimed, while not having first completed the essential digital mapping first, and refusing to recognise that it was flawed, and while doing it on a computer that they hadn't tested properly and that was not up to the job, and using an approach which split up the work into different tasks performed in different parts of the country, which made it impossible, absolutely physically impossible, to track the progress of any individual claim, while cancelling the management information system, which would have provided them with information on what was happening, and also scrapping the contingency plan, which would have at least allowed them to make part payments. And at the same time, they sacked all their most experienced staff, their most experienced managers and staff, and replaced them with temporary, unskilled agency workers who were forced to work unsocial hours on the minimum wage. And surprisingly enough, it didn't really go very well. And you can look at nearly any government department in almost any era, under any government of any party, and find similar stories. That is one of the most baroque, but it's only by degree different rather than different in kind. So one can have a lot of fun talking about these famous cock-ups, but what can we do about it, and what can Parliament do about it? What can the scrutiny process do about it? Why are the problems so intractable? I think it's worth pointing out that it is not Parliament's job to run the government. That is the job of the executive. And it's not obvious on its face that the process of scrutiny in and of itself will prevent all of these mistakes. Although you might hope over a period of time that there would be some form of learning curve and that people would learn from their mistakes and that in the future they would make fewer mistakes. But not only is that not the case, not only do people not learn from mistakes, very often because when mistakes are made, particularly if it's around IT and around computer systems, the natural response of those involved is to go stumm, to go completely quiet, and finding out exactly what went wrong and why is often a very, very laborious and forensic exercise that is carried out years afterwards, and quite often the true horror of what went wrong never fully sees the light of day. And also, not only do they not learn from the mistakes, they then proceed to make them again. And one of the other reasons around that is that the staff in Whitehall are very, very frequently moved around. Ministers, members of Parliament, of course not all ministers are MPs, some come from the House of Lords, and some are pulled in from the outside, especially for the purpose, and made peers in the House of Lords in order to do a job of work at a particular ministry. And the new Minister of Trade, Ian, trying to remember his surname, who's the he's the ex-BT Chief Executive, has just taken over. Thank you, Ian Livingston, Lord Livingston now. He was Group Finance Director of Dixon's, and then he was responsible for FreeServe, I learned recently, if any of you still got FreeServe or even remember FreeServe from all those years ago. But yes, he was Chief Executive of BT. He's just come into government as Trade Minister, replacing Lord Green, Stephen Green, who was Chief Executive of HSBC, the bank, and who wrote a very good book called Good Value, by the way. He's also an ordained minister in the Church of England. If any of you is ever in a trivia quiz and wants to know which bank chief executive is a Church of England minister, it's him. So you've got people coming in from outside, but the majority of people, of course, are members of Parliament. And when they become ministers, they change very frequently as well. And there are certain hard truths around the way the political process works, which means that that's never going to change, probably. I think this government has been slightly better than many of its predecessors in changing people less frequently. In the last government, you had 6 social security secretaries in 6 years, 4 education secretaries in 4 years, 6 or 7 local government ministers in 6 or 7 years, 9 housing ministers. I think we're on our 11th housing minister in 11 years now, there having been a change of government. It is just part of the picture, and it does definitely impact adversely on good government. But there are broader issues which simply don't seem to go away. The same things crop up again and again. The failure in IT is a classic one because many people who are involved in the commissioning of IT don't understand what it is that's different about IT from other kinds of procurement. That's something I dwell on at some length in the book because I think it's so important that we start to understand. That's to say, we lay people who know, I say we in the first person plural advisedly, with caution, because maybe some of you who are also technologists, but we who are lay people in relation to information technology, I think, and who study government and politics, I think need to take seriously the idea that everybody going into the civil service and going into ministries as government ministers ought to understand something more than they do about why it is that IT projects go so wrong so often. And certainly when I was writing that chapter of the book, I found it to be the single most interesting chapter in many ways. But there are many other issues. The very high staff turnover I've already mentioned. The lack of information inside Whitehall as to what's going on, particularly the lack of information about money and how much things cost. These are very hardy perennials, and you will find people saying, as if it's a surprise to them, that these things are still true, even though they were true 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago. The lack of financial management and the ability to use the financial management function to help take better strategic decisions. The lack of good project management, very often, because the management of projects is not a skill that's valued inside Whitehall, and being a good project manager is either something that people simply don't know about, haven't heard of, are not aware of, or they don't see it as a route to the top. The lack of capability in procurement and the fact that people doing the buying in government departments are, even though government spends many tens of billions, depending on which number, depending on how you count it, the government spends between 100 and 200 billion pounds a year on a variety of different goods and services. And plainly, in the private sector, there are consultancies that have sprung up that make a very good living advising large organisations in the private sector and to some extent in the public sector on how to procure better. Because if you are spending, shall we say, £300 million a year on cartridges for your computers, for your printers, for your worldwide office network, then plainly 1% is worth having. And that applies across large different areas of procurement, and yet it's not something which is seen as a route to the top. So the nitty-gritty of these sorts of management issues does not often find a resonance among the high-flying graduates who are imagining that they're going to go to the top of the civil service. Another issue that comes up again and again and again is the lack of coherence at the centre of government, even though it's full of very, very bright people. There are a number of good parliamentary reports, I think one or two of them on the reading list, which try to address this. By the centre, I mean the Treasury, the Cabinet Office, and Number 10, largely. And you have, of course, had this plethora of the growth of special advisors in a considerable degree over the last. I mean, it's not new; it's been going on since at least the 1970s. Bernard Donahue of this parish was a special advisor, I think, to Harold Wilson in the 1970s, and to Jim Callaghan. And so it's not new, but the extent of it and what they do has become much more significant. And famously or infamously, at the last election the outset of the last government before the present one, with Blair in 1997, the first thing they did almost was pass an order in council to give certain senior special advisors, namely Alistair Campbell and Jonathan Powell, who's the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and his press man, I think there was one other as well, the power to issue orders to civil servants, which hitherto had never been done before. And people get very excited about that and issues like that. So there are a lot of wicked issues, thorny issues that just don't seem to go away and that carry on no matter who's in office, and that, where we simply don't seem to learn the lessons. I'll say a word about the way other committees work, but not a lot. I sat on the European Scrutiny Committee for 4 years, which looks at the huge volume of legislation coming through from Brussels. When I say legislation, of course, some of it's technical, and some of it's technical regulations and directives, and some of it's much more broad brush. But there's a huge amount of it, and the parliamentary office of the European Scrutiny Committee is 4 or 5 times larger than that of any other select committee, simply to deal with it. And when you're a member, you come into the room, there's about 1,000 pages, maybe 1,500 pages of briefs, basically with a colour code attached to them. They're called A briefs, B briefs, and C briefs, depending upon how politically relevant or sensitive the committee administration and staff think they are. The A briefs are the more politically important ones, the C briefs are the most technical and boring ones, and the others, the B briefs, are somewhere in between. And the idea of the committee is that it sit there and scrutinise these week by week and recommend what's needed for debate. And it is the almost ultimate triumph of form over substance, because almost nothing ever changes as a result of its work. Quite often, the committee will get very exercised about the fact that the proceedings of a particular EU measure are taking place, are proceeding on the wrong legal base. There'll be an article in the treaty that will be being misused because there's no obvious legal authority for the EU to take the action that it's going to take. And so they find one of the catch-all articles and then twist it all out of shape. Article 308 was the one in my day. I think it's changed now because there's been so many different treaties. But they'll take one of the catch-all articles and then twist that to their purposes, so that, I'm talking about in the European Commission and the European Council, so that they can get it through. And then Parliament looks at it, gets hot under the collar about it, and then it carries on. So it doesn't really make a lot of difference to anything. And I have to say, apart from the fact that it was an extremely good source of information, I came off the committee largely because they changed the time, and I couldn't do it with my present committee as well. But it really didn't seem, to be perfectly honest, to change a whole lot. I think it's probably true in relation to our committee that it changes quite a lot. If you look at the Treasury minutes that government produces in response to all our reports, analyses have been done which suggest that 95% of the recommendations are followed up. Now, it's very easy to say in the minute that you're going to accept a recommendation to do something about it. It's another thing actually then to go and do something about it. And we as a committee historically have not been nearly as good as we should have been at following up to make sure that what they say they're going to do, they actually do. And we are trying to get more systematic about that. although, as I mentioned, the European Scrutiny Committee has 15 or 16 members of staff, we only have 4. The difference for us is that we've got the National Audit Office behind us, and that's the difference between us and most other select committees as well. Other committees would take one topic and worry it for a long period of time, possibly over 4 or 5 sessions over a period of a couple of months, and then do a lot of work around it and produce their own report, which they write themselves with the help of their own clerks. Although they have more time, they're also looking at policy, which we explicitly don't do, and therefore they're more likely to find that they're dividing along political lines, along party lines, unless they avoid subjects of enormous political controversy. And so you will sometimes get minority reports in the select committee, in the reports of other line departmental select committees in the way that you don't with ours. So in some ways we have an advantage, but of course we have less time, which is a disadvantage. I suppose the biggest advantage for our committee is that the National Audit Office, which reports to Parliament through us, has statutory access to departments in the way that other committees don't. So we, although the NAO is not a mirror to us in the sense that they show us every single thing that they see, they can show us anything that they want to show us, and they can literally look for and ask for every single email, and they can do a forensic audit to whatever level of detail that they want. And that statutory access makes an enormous difference, not only to the work of the NAO, but to the power and effectiveness of our own work and our own recommendations. So I've said a little bit about the National Audit Office reports and our concomitant PAC reports, and how baroque can be the excesses that are underlined and exposed. I've said something about the fact that the same problems seem to occur again and again and again, as if there's no learning curve in effect in many ways. But there is a larger truth, which I think it's really something which many people are not aware of. Charles Clarke said this in evidence to the Public Administration Committee in one of the reports. It's actually, this really is, if you've got the time, I do recommend, oops, I'm in the wrong place, sorry. If you've got the time, I do recommend, I'll go back to, I'm here already. This one here, Public Administration, Select Committee, Politics and Administration, Ministers and Civil Servants, HC 122. I would go for the, and have a look at both of them. They're both available on the web. They're both available here. This one here, which is the as it were, the verbatim transcripts. If you've got nothing better to do on a wet afternoon, then sitting down with a cup of tea and reading this, I just think is fascinating. I mean, I really do. It's absolutely fascinating. And one of the witnesses, Charles Clarke, did say, until you've to this committee, I think it was, until you've been in government, until you've actually seen what it's like, it's very hard to understand the scale of government from the outside. Of course, most members of Parliament have not run large organisations. They might have worked for large organisations earlier in their careers, but they wouldn't have necessarily worked for them. I worked for an investment bank, but when I worked for it, it had 1,500 members of staff when I started and 3,000 when I left. That investment bank, now called Barclays Capital, has got 25,000 staff now. So it's a completely different order of magnitude. If you look at the Department for Work and Pensions, for example, this was a point that Sir Richard Mottram made in his capstone lecture, which he gave in the school 2 or 3 years ago. The DWP, he said, is an organisation of world scale. I mean, the amount of money that it spends each year is out of sight. It's around £200,000 million, about 200 billion a year, or in dollars, $334 billion. Compare that with BP, which is 375 billion of annual income. This is in dollars, or Chevron on 245 billion, or in what I think is a politically correct reference at the moment, particularly if you're German and depend on your gas from Russia, Gazprom, which is on 157 billion of annual income and annual revenue. In other words, the Department for Work and Pensions is about 40% larger than Chevron, a little smaller than BP, and about double the size of Gazprom. It is absolutely enormous, and that's just one part of, that's just one department. That's just one department of government. Now, as it happens, they spend more than anybody else by a long way, by a country mile. The government as a whole spends about, well, in this year it'll be around 600 and, actually when I wrote my book it was 673, but I think it's going to be over 700 now, 720 billion pounds. And so you're talking well over a trillion US dollars every year. These are huge sums of money. And I suppose the work of our committees, pointing up all the problems that we see, are just drawing back the curtain on a phenomenon, which is that while you would expect that something that large would have the level of management skill and management attention that would be commensurate with something of that scale, as you would have in a large multinational organisation, in government that's simply not the case. So there's a fundamental asymmetry between what would happen in the private sector for something of this scale and what happens in government. And as a result, we can't necessarily be surprised by the consequences. I don't mean by that we need thousands more managers, but I do mean that we need to be much clearer about what it is that we're expecting people to do, what we're expecting them to be responsible for, and how we hold them to account. And in the private sector, it's relatively easy. I mean, there are many difficult things about running an organisation, particularly a large one, although in some ways running a large one has benefits that make it a lot easier than running a small or a medium-sized business, where you are really much more exposed and much more at the hard edge. When you've got size, you have a bit of clout, even in the private sector. But consider the people who go into politics and government. Consider the people who become members of Parliament and how they get there. Consider the people who become civil servants and how they get there. Think about the selection route that you undertake in order to become a candidate in a seat that you will probably lose in order to have a chance of becoming a candidate in a seat that you might win. And consider how that is likely to impact on your ability to understand what it is to be in charge of a very large organisation. Because the truth of the matter is, if you're spending most of the best years of your life shoving leaflets through doors and working your way up inside a political party, it's unlikely that you will end up in a position running BP or running Chevron because you are too busy doing other things. In the civil service, most people who go into the civil service, not all, and there is now a trend, an increasing trend, of people coming into the civil service at higher levels, particularly at the Director General level, what's called the G2 level, just below Permanent Secretary, to run things, to be the chief executive of a particular agency. One of the reasons for that is because it might seem like a good idea if the government's got a call centre to have somebody with 20 years experience running call centres, and who wouldn't say amen to that? But one of the other issues is that the civil service as a body has not produced over the years a corpus of people. I'm being tautological here. The civil service has not taken in and then produced 20 years later a corpus of people who are capable of running everything. And they have to look elsewhere to get the skills that they need. It's got nothing to do with the intelligence of the people they're hiring. The civil service continues to hire some of the brightest people in the country from some of the best universities. The top of the top universities, this place, Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, these are good recruiting grounds for the civil service, just as they're good recruiting grounds for the consultancies, the investment banks and the big corporations. So it's got nothing to do with whether these people are intelligent or not. It's got to do with what happens after they're taken in and how they're then managed and how their careers are developed and brought on in the subsequent 20 years. And very often that places a premium on getting a broad and generalist range of knowledge. And these in many ways are not new points, which is the slightly depressing point about it. So that when they, 20 to 25 years later, emerge at the top of a government department, they're in a position to help, they know something about policy development, and they're in a position to help a minister with a thorny problem get through the week. So as one of the National Audit Office's former Controller and Auditor General, Sir John Bourne, once put it, while the top jobs in the civil service should go to those people with a successful track record of delivering major programs and projects in construction, in defence, in social welfare, in tax, and so on, what they are generally done, what generally happens is the top jobs are given to people who are good at helping the minister get through the week. And that very often means who are very good verbally and who are very good at drafting and very good at explaining their way out of problems, rather than trying to make sure that the problems don't occur in the first place. Now, there have been plenty of thoughts about this over the last 50 years. I mean, just going back to the Fulton report, and while you're at it, I didn't bother to put it on this list, but I mean, I won't talk about it at length at all, although I mention it a little bit in the book. If you get the chance, and it's on, I looked it up this afternoon, Peter Hennis's book Whitehall, which I'm sure is on many of your reading lists, is available for 1p plus post on Amazon. It is a very, very good book indeed, in terms of a history of the last 100 years of Whitehall. In relation to the Fulton report, there is a particularly good book that's highly partial by Norman Crowther-Hunt, Lord Crowther-Hunt and Peter Kellner, called The Civil Servants, An Inquiry into Britain's Ruling Class, which Crowther-Hunt, having sat on the Fulton Committee, which was a committee set up by Harold Wilson to try and think through from the broadest principles how you reformed the civil service to make it fit for purpose. And this was a process that started in the 1960s, and indeed ended in the 1960s. The reason it's a very partial account is because there was what he calls a deliberate gelding that took place by the permanent secretaries to limit the terms of reference, which is always a classic Whitehall manoeuvre, to make sure that it didn't do anything too fundamental to the structures of the civil service. But it's a very important benchmark, because it's probably in the last 100 years, I mean certainly post Second World War, it's where the big attempts at reform started. But thereafter, you're really looking at the early 80s and Mrs. Thatcher, who brought in her favourite company, Marks & Spencer, Derek Rayner from Marks & Spencer, and introduced what was known as the FMI, the Financial Management Initiative, the purpose of which was to, it sounds fairly simple, to give managers a clearer view of their objectives, give them ways to measure performance in relation to those objectives, give them well-defined responsibilities for making the best use of their resources, making sure that they could find out how much it cost to get something done and whether it was value for money, so they needed information about how much things cost, as well as access to training and advice which they needed to exercise their responsibilities effectively. It was all good stuff and fairly common sense. 5 years later, his successor, Derek Rayner's successor as the head of the Mrs. Thatcher Cabinet Office Efficiency Unit, which Mrs. Thatcher had in the centre, was Sir Robin Ibbs, who came from the then big company ICI, and who drove through what became known as the Next Steps process, because the report was called Management in Government, the Next Steps. The idea of it being, and Kate Jenkins, I'm sure, I think she's talked to your group, wrote a wonderful book about it called Politicians and Public Services, implementing change in a clash of cultures. And I can't recommend that book highly enough. It really is first class. She talks at length about this process, the result of which was that 70 to 80% of the domestic civil service, everything from the driver vehicle licensing agency to the National Archives, was hived off into executive agencies, the idea being that they were to, as it were, do the work, and then a much smaller cadre of policy civil servants were to dream up the policy. There are any number of complexities around that, particularly around either whether it's possible to separate policy from implementation, whether any of the authors of the Next Steps report thought that it was possible to separate policy from implementation. Because if you read Kate's book, she will tell you very clearly that they never ever came to that conclusion. And they never ever would have said that actually you needed both. You needed a balanced expertise in policy making and in execution, which very, very rarely was actually possessed by people. But in the way it came out in the wash, it was almost universally interpreted as what Alan Whitehead, who was a senior Labour MP, called separating steerers from rowers. So you had the people who did the work and the people who dreamt up what it was that they should be doing, separated from one another. And in terms of a civil service reform that actually was implemented and changed the architecture of the civil service, it was very, very extensive and successful. The shape of Whitehall looked completely different at the end of it, and we still have the results of it today with all the consequences. But there were many other attempts at reform, some of which were less and some of which were more successful. Just from 1994 onwards, we had a white paper called Continuity and Change. We saw the development of what was known as the Citizens' Charter by John Major to try and give citizens some sort of rights of redress and some sort of sense of what they ought to be entitled to. Shortly after that, we had Taking Forward Continuity and Change. Then after the Blair government took office, we had Modernising Government. This featured a whole panoply of different initiatives, including of a steady stream of reports and discussion documents, performance partnership agreements. There was at least one vision in there. They set up a delivery unit, a strategy unit, a reform strategy team, a transformation unit, an e-transformation unit, a corporate development group, an Office of Public Service Reform, which was presumably established in case people thought there wasn't enough going on, and it went on and on. And a couple of years afterwards, there was another white paper called Civil Service Reforms, Delivery and Values, which Martin Stanley, if you ever get the chance, do take a look at it. I might even be able to stick it up, it's civilservant.org is his website. And he's a former civil servant who's turned into a sort of Whitehall commentator. He wrote a book called How to be a Civil Servant, which he then turned into a website, and he's constantly updating, and it is one of the best sources out there actually now. Definitely worth taking a look at. And he described Civil Service Reforms, Delivery and Values as a document which sought to herald major changes in the way the civil service is managed and organised without going into the sort of detail which could create opposition. And it had a very short outcomes section and no dates or numerical targets of any kind. This was followed by Civil Service Reforms, Delivery and Values 1 year on, which looked at how much progress they'd made since they'd started the original delivery and values process. In 2005, there was an initiative, this was largely Gus O'Donnell's baby, the former Cabinet Secretary, called Capability Reviews, the purpose of which was to try and assess the extent to which Whitehall had the capability to do its job. And these reviews looked at 10 different capabilities in each of 17 different government departments, things like financial management, e-government, human resources, and so on. And the rather embarrassing conclusion was that in 2/3 of these 170 snapshots, government was, quote, less than well placed to deliver its priorities. Following that, after Gordon Brown became Prime Minister, we had Putting the Front Line First, Smarter Government, which called for, rather breathlessly actually, a step change in how government is run for the turbulent times ahead, delivering better public services for lower cost. And it identified 12, they all identify key actions, by the way, and you can go and look them up if you want to. But they're all key actions to strengthen the role of citizens and civic society, recast the relationship between the centre and the front line, and streamline government for sharper delivery. Just reading it makes you feel better. At the launch event, Gordon Brown said, "Our plans will mean some of the most sweeping changes in administration in this country for half a century." But actually, it was really about cutting the civil service pay bill for senior civil servants and scrapping or merging some arm's length bodies and one or two other things. When Francis Maude became Cabinet Office Minister, he waited a couple of years, and then in 2012 produced a document called the Civil Service Reform Plan, which 8 months afterwards, the Reform think Tank did a survey around in Whitehall and asked people what they thought of it, and nearly all of them said it had made no difference to their daily working lives. But no matter, because last year the government produced the Civil Service Reform Plan 1 year on. So that's 9 attempts, 9 major pushes to get civil service reform onto the agenda in the last 20 or 19 years. It's almost at the rate of 1 every 2 years. And if the problem were lack of ideas, then I think we'd have solved it by now. It's quite plain that the problem is not lack of bullet points in fine-sounding documents. This, by the way, the public administration document I referred to earlier, Good Government, it's wonderful. I mean, it's one of the best. I mean, if you're going to have a list, at least have a good one. This is a good list. Good people, good process, good accountability, good performance, and good standards. Oh, you can't see it, I'm sorry. Let me just do it like that. There you go. Good people, good process, good accountability, good performance, and good standards. We need to be able to recruit and cultivate the right people. We need appropriate structures, systems, and procedures. We need adequate arrangements to ensure that people, both elected and appointed, are held to account, so we have good accountability. We need effective performance assessment, and we need high ethical standards. And that's not a bad report, actually. There's some good material in there, although I don't think it's nearly as interesting. I can't recommend this one highly enough. The volume 2 of that one, I think, is terrific, but just because it's much more about how things really are. But plainly, it's not about lists. It's not about coming up with the nth reform plan. Now, I'm going to talk just briefly, and then I'll bring my remarks to a conclusion, and we'll do some Q&A. about one particular attempt, and that was something I referred to earlier, the delivery unit. There was a man called Sir Michael Barber who was brought in by David Blunkett originally into the Department of Education and did what was thought to have been a good enough job that Tony Blair snaffled him for the number 10, what he called delivery unit, and he set it up and ran it. Michael Barber's idea was that if you simply are precise enough, if you have enough clarity about your performance indicators, what it was that you want delivered, and you have enough stringency in the way in which you oversee and manage these, then you will get the results that you want. In fact, he called for an irreversible transformation of structure, culture, and results. And if you think about the word irreversible, you tend to find it in science. A very good example of something that's irreversible, an irreversible transformation, is the movement of heat from an area of high temperature to an area of lower temperature. It's something that happens spontaneously, and it's irreversible. You can't, as it were, put the heat back where it was. And even though it's very complex and involves some hard maths, the idea of irreversibility in the hard sciences is something that you can, to some extent, calculate and predict and manage, because they behave. That's to say, the fundamental constants at the heart of our universe behave in a consistent way usually, whereas of course human beings don't necessarily. And while it's true that politicians like using the word irreversible, and indeed the Labour Party manifesto in 1974 called for a fundamental and irreversible shift in the balance of power in favour of working people, power and wealth, and a fundamental and irreversible shift in the balance of power and wealth in favour of working people and their families. And Mrs. Thatcher, when she was still on a bit of roll in 1987, when she was really at the height of her powers, I suppose, said nearly exactly the same to the Conservative Party conference that October. She said that the Conservative government's reforms were an irreversible shift of power in favour of working people and their families. But you try and apply that in the real world in management speak, and you will find people very often responding in ways that you hadn't expected. And this is exactly what happened with the delivery unit. It happened in hospitals where they said we'd have a 4-hour waiting target. But in fact, it was extremely easy because much of the waiting target was around the total number of people in the hospital, which was around the amount of elective surgery. So if you cancelled the elective surgery, the 4 hours was very easily achieved. Or if you weren't going to achieve it, you could just take a patient on a trolley and put a curtain around it. You could call it a ward rather than a corridor, and suddenly you'd achieved your target. And you could move a patient on a computer to show that they'd been moved from A&E into a ward and admitted, even though it actually took 1 hour to do it, but on the computer they appeared to have been moved. The same happened in the police, who became very adept at playing with targets. Their favourite was a domestic dispute between a husband and a wife, which offered the police the opportunity to book 2 separate assaults, issue 2 warnings, and allow 2 crimes to be recorded both as detected and cleared up. So you had 8 boxes ticked just for one little fight, one little tiff between a husband and a wife. Schools, of course, got in on the act, and they did the same with things like the reported exam results. They would find easier exam boards, they would teach to the test. If the threshold for passing was 30%, they would concentrate on the people in the 28th and 29th percentiles and ignore the people down at the bottom. They would encourage people who were going to fail to stay at home on the day of the test, making the overall percentage who'd passed look better, and many other tricks like that. What becomes quite apparent, however much you try to exhort from the top, is that and however many lists with reforms in them you conjure up, and as I said, I think 9 or 10 in the space of 19 years sort of makes the point. The ultimate reality is you're not going to change anything unless you change behaviour. It is behaviour at the rock face that really makes the biggest difference to what actually happens. It's behaviour at the rock face that determines whether things actually get done or not. And my contention is that I think recovery is the best word, because after all, economics in the 18th century was very much about human behaviour, not just about how people behaved, but how it was that they were supposed to behave. And that was very much lost when we were queuing outside to get in here. We saw an awful lot of algebra on the wall, and I'm afraid there's still an awful lot of mathematics in economics. But the fact is that as economics became more mathematical in the 20th century, it became less interested in human behaviour and probably less interesting. And what's happened in the last 25 to 30 years or so is that economics has recovered some of its earliest interest in behaviour, and the fact that if you're really to understand the way an economy works, you really need to understand how humans really behave rather than how they are supposed to behave. My simple contention is that if that's true in economics, then it's true elsewhere as well. The government, of course, has actually acknowledged this. That's why we saw them set up the Behavioural Insights Unit, which was originally in the Cabinet Office, so I think it's now been hived off. And the idea of this was that you should take, for example, somebody's tax return, and instead of, when they don't pay their tax, sending them a threatening letter saying you haven't paid your tax, see you in court, they sent them a what I suppose you'd call a nudge letter, saying, did you know that 89% of people in your part of Devon have already paid their income tax? And the results of doing this were absolutely startling. Just for the cost of a postage stamp, they were getting hundreds of millions of pounds of revenue in. And of course this is now being applied to lots of different areas of government's work, whether it's the attempts to control smoking or obesity, or you can think of lots of different areas of public policy where this may apply. The one area where it doesn't seem to have been considered yet, which I think would be one of the most powerful, is to the work of government itself. In other words, instead of just taking this searchlight, this very powerful behavioural searchlight, and pointing it at the folk out there, the taxpayers, and by using this behavioural searchlight, getting them to see better how it is that, allowing us to see better how we might induce the right kinds of behaviour, we should take that searchlight and shine it on the behaviour of ministers. We should shine it on the behaviour of civil servants. We should shine it on the interactions between ministers and civil servants. We should shine it on the interactions between ministers and civil servants and Parliament. And I think if we did that, we would start to see some of the step changes in performance that have already been witnessed in parts of the private sector, where in the most successful companies in the world, you see the consistent theme, whether they are in services or whether they are in manufacturing or whether they are in computing, the consistent theme that stands out, that is the standout marker, you might almost call it the stigmata, of the most successful companies, is that they place a disproportionate effort on how they develop and bring on their people. And it's that marks them out. And we are, I'm afraid, as far as the public sector and as far as government is concerned, still very much in the foothills of that in the public sector. Right, well, I'll stop there.
Right, very good. Thanks, Richard. Okay, perhaps I could begin by picking up something that you referred to, but which is clearly a serious challenge. If you have anything other than small projects, any project of scale is likely, as you've implied yourself, to last beyond the life of one minister or one permanent secretary as the accounting officer for the department. And any substantial project will last beyond the life of one, possibly two, conceivably three ministers and 1, 2, 3, 4 permanent secretaries. Now, that means that anybody who signs a contract sort of knows that their successor will be certainly the civil servant who comes before your select committee, the PAC, in order to explain why things either did or did not work out. So, in a sense, if everybody knows that, there's almost a game, really, isn't there? When everybody who is involved in government knows that by the time this particular project comes to fruition, they'll have moved on, and at some level, nobody could honestly hold them to account because other people implemented it, other people will answer for it. Yeah. I mean, isn't that an almost, and that's kind of reinforced by the fact that competitive politics between government and opposition, or even between the PAC independently and the government of the day, will mean that the government will find it better to carry on with a project than to back off.
There's an awful lot of truth in that, and it is a central problem. Where you are talking about, there are two things that I want to say. First of all, it's very often the case that the person who is originally responsible as accounting officer will have moved on. But one of the things as a committee that we've done is say to ourselves, well, this may no longer be the accounting officer now. We did this with Dame Helen Ghost. She was still in the civil service. She now runs the National Trust. But although she was no longer the permanent secretary of the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, she'd moved on to the Home Office. She had been the civil servant in charge of the project at the time. This was the Rural Payments Agency. And so we had her back because she knew more about it. And although Whitehall loved to have this, Whitehall loved to promote this culture where the so-called the accounting officer is the only person who should be the witness. Actually, in reality, they themselves admit that it's better, I've seen them do this, they did this in relation to MG Rover, to have the previous witness, the previous accounting officer back, who knows more about it. And when we had the hearing on MG Rover, we had the previous accounting officer, who'd actually moved out of the public sector altogether, together with Sir Brian Bender, whose most frequent response to a question was, well, you'd better ask Catherine, she was there, she knows more about it. So there are things you can do to some extent, but I don't pretend that's a panacea, because in the nature of big projects, they will often go on for many years. If you're trying to build an aircraft carrier, for example, it will go on for many, many years. And to take that example about signing contracts and then the terms and conditions changing, in that particular example, a political decision was taken because of the need to keep the amount of the total defence procurement budget spent on the aircraft carrier within a certain envelope within 1 year. Contractually, that meant that the shipyard was sitting with not enough to do because they slowed it down, and in the jargon they moved the budget to the right, so that for quite a long period they had to recompense the shipyard for sitting there idle doing very little, because when the shipyard undertook to build the aircraft carrier, they did so on the basis that they would do it within a certain timetable, and they had to have within the contract reassurance that if something happened that they were going to slow down, that wouldn't adversely affect their own ability, because it was something that was outside their control. The consequence of that, just prior to 2010, was to add 1.5 billion or more to the cost of the aircraft carrier, and there have been other decisions of a similar nature that have done more since, so that the overall cost of it has around doubled. And when you try and pick back through who was responsible for each individual decision, it is quite difficult. What do we do about it? Well, I think there are a number of things. I think, first of all, and there is no simple or quick solution to any of this. If there were, it would have been done by now. This is something that Kate says in her book. But one of the things we do have to do, I think, is make sure that we have a much bigger cadre of civil servants at the top of government with deep commercial experience and the ability to run things. And although there have been a variety of attempts to make this happen over the last few years, it's not a new idea that we should do this. The Major Projects Authority, sitting in the Cabinet Office with the academy, which they now have at the Saïd Business School at Oxford, the Major Projects Leadership Academy, is probably the best attempt that we have seen in a very long time. I mean, I want to see the point where it is normal for most Director Generals and most Permanent Secretaries to have been through that process, and also, by the way, before they get to the point where they're promoted to Director Generals and Permanent Secretaries, to have run successfully and delivered successfully projects. And it's only by doing that that they get to be promoted. So that's one strand of it. Another strand of it is to make sure that members of Parliament and those who may become ministers, who are mostly drawn from members of Parliament, have a deeper understanding of the tension between managing a large organisation and letting what are often long-term contracts and the political requirements of the present day and the electoral cycle. And they learn on the job mostly about that without necessarily having had any inkling beforehand. Liam Byrne's an interesting case because he was a senior figure at Accenture before he went into government, but I can't even remember which project he was working on, but someone was telling me recently that no one in the department at the time, he was in the Home Office and the Cabinet Office, I think it was a Home Office project, dared tell him that each week that he didn't make a decision was costing £1 million a week for not making a decision, but no one had actually dared point this out to him. So it was rumbling on for quite a few weeks while a decision didn't get made. So you've also then got the issue of how people treat each other inside. This again is about behaviour and it's about fear, the way in which civil servants inside departments relate to and respond to ministers, and the extent to which they're prepared to have the kind of open dialogue that's needed, and that they're sure that if they do that, that they won't get punished for it.
Okay. Anybody like to open? Come here, or come out there. Come here first, yes, Francesca. So can I just repeat it? The question is about the relationship between the major consultancy firms, often I can strengthen the question if I may, acting as advisors to government, and where you might say where the entire industry had a collective interest in projects going forward, you might add to your point, which is a good one. And then if things go wrong, the poor old civil servants and ministers take the blame, not their advisors.
Yeah. There are a lot of points in there. The first one about strategy consulting, and there was a big shift. I mean, consulting really grew out of time and motion studies and manufacturing originally. PE International, which was a famous consultancy 20, 30 years ago, stood for production engineering. PA consulting, which is still around, PA stands for personnel administration, because you got computers to do things like personnel and the payroll rather than doing it by hand. Management consultancy grew in a variety of different directions. The accounting firms realised that they had a great window into a lot of businesses, and they got in on the act in the 60s and particularly the 1970s and 80s. And then the IT firms realised the same, and they got in on the act. And the strategy firms such as McKinsey and Boston Consulting and the people who had been doing traditional strategy consulting found they were, unless they were of the very, very highest quality, they were getting squeezed because people didn't want a fat report that gave them a strategy. They wanted something that was implementable. In fact, they ideally wanted somebody to implement it. And the firms that undertook to take on staff and do the outsourced providing of functions, whether it was finance or IT, and the classic ones obviously are cooking and security and cleaning, but the business of outsourcing spread into all these other different services. And strategy consulting firms that couldn't do that, because no, we just think, we write high-flown thoughts, and that they began to be squeezed a little. And so they started to move into the implementation space. And I should declare an interest because I used to represent the consulting industry 20 years ago. I found it very interesting, and I actually didn't understand until I'd done that. I worked there for a couple of years at the Management Consultants Association, just what an interesting subject management was. And the fact that, and we used to have a management book prize, and all these titles used to appear on my desk, some of which were truly dreadful and some of which were outstanding. But it is an extremely interesting subject, one which I think is not paid sufficient attention to. A lot of the people who do it come strangely, actually not strangely, from psychology backgrounds. I think typically they are underrepresented inside government, which is why government then has to buy them in from outside. And what's happened as the whole of the economy, by which I mean the private sector economy, has shifted towards a much more outsourced model. I mean, BP Exploration outsourced its finance department in 1987 to what was then Anderson Consulting and became Accenture. This was a landmark deal at the time because the idea that you could outsource your entire finance function was really revolutionary 25 years ago. But as that process became more and more common right across the economy, government started to do it too. And then government became, to a much greater extent, dependent on these large consulting firms who were prepared to take on large numbers of staff and use IT to do things more efficiently. And you then got the enormous growth of these big systems integrating firms like CSC and CMG and Anderson, and then all the others who'd been accountants like Pricewaterhouse realised they had to get in on it as well. And you've now got this rather unhealthy, Francis Maud always calls it an oligopoly, of very large players who have occupied this space and have a really quite close, not to say incestuous, relationship with government, and as Tony was saying, a huge vested interest in its continuing. So if the government wants to do anything and has an idea that might possibly involve the deployment of IT, not only have you got somebody there who can say, I've got a great idea of how you can do this, but they will also say, actually, you need to use such and such a system. You might even want to use our proprietary system, or we can write one for you, or we can put 500 people on that for the next 6 months. What they don't tell you is we've got 500 people on our books we're paying a salary to every month, and we've got to put them somewhere for the next 6 months, so it might as well be with you. And that has distorted the entire landscape so that big projects have become big business for the outsourcing firms in a way that it really has changed the picture. It's not to say that they don't necessarily add value, because very often they can, and very often they have skills that on the civil service pay scales, people internally are not willing to pay for. We had Sir Bernard Grey from the Ministry of Defence the other day. He's the Chief of Defence Materiel. And he said, you can get any number of administrators, there's not a shortage of those. But if I want an an airworthiness engineer for looking at aircraft to make sure that they're safe to fly and to certificate them as safe to fly, I cannot find one. He's got 800 vacancies across the MOD in technical specialties. And so guess what happens? They end up getting somebody from PricewaterhouseCoopers or one of the other big firms on a contract, perhaps on a rolling contract, and the person at PwC is paying their staff member a higher rate, and then they're charging it out to the government at a healthy margin. So the government ends up paying 3 times what it would pay if it had hired somebody directly and then just given them a bit more. So it's an enormous area. I'm sorry, it's a rather short answer, but very, very important subject, and one that has had insufficient attention.
But to go directly to the point, when something goes wrong and the PAC decides and the National Audit Office decides something has gone wrong, would you bring to give evidence a company that had given advice, or would you just, as it were, hold the permanent secretary, the accounting officer, accountable for having made the wrong decision to employ the company?
We routinely have firms in to give evidence as well, and how candid they are varies. We had. This is a slightly different area from well, it's not really, I suppose, because it still involves IT. But we had, you'll recall in the news recently, the stories about people being tagged who were dead or who had left prison. But Serco and G4S were still claiming and invoicing for these tagged people, even though they didn't exist. We had Serco and G4S and Capita and Atos, who do they provide the medical assessments under contract to the Department for Work and Pensions as to whether people are entitled to various disability benefits. And they have just those 4 have £10,000 million of business with government. So it is becoming an increasing part of our work that we regularly have them in. You will sometimes find, and the DEFRA Select Committee did a big inquiry on the Royal Payments Agency as well as the one we did, and they actually said in their report, this was some years ago now, that Accenture was not nearly as candid as they might have been, because when they're sitting there as witnesses, they want to protect their commercial interests, and they don't want to expose their own folly, and they certainly don't want to expose the folly of their client. So sometimes you have to delve quite hard, and the best evidence that you usually get is the brown envelope, that something comes through in the post, and I've had a number of those, or the dirty facts, where you've got something that's gold dust through a whistleblower. So, you have to work. Sometimes it's like being an investigative journalist, and I don't for 1 minute believe that we get to the bottom of everything in every case. We don't, by no means. But it's a very important area and growing.
We're nearly up to 6:30. One final question. I mean, you've elegantly described a number of spheres of government, big projects which have not worked out. Of course, there are others that do, but these were ones that were and you've produced some general challenges like the turnover of ministers, the lack of experience, and so on. But it's clear that the current Public Accounts Committee, and you referred to some of these elements last week, with its greater degree of legitimacy, because all the individual MPs on it are elected and the chair is elected. And the current chair and its leading members have had a far higher profile even than the PAC normally has in this Parliament, because Mrs. Hodge, the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee, has obviously decided that more effort needs to be made publicly to, as it were, galvanise a wider public reaction to put more pressure back, for example, on the matter of tax payments. Yes. Yeah. Do you think that approach is one that future Public Accounts Committees will sustain?
I don't know. I think the English language has a new verb, to be hodged. And it's certainly true that Margaret's very, very adept at finding the right line to pursue in terms of heightening the publicity. And I think there are different truths floating around simultaneously in Whitehall. People will say, well, this is getting to be too much of a circus and it's no longer going to get taken seriously as a committee. And in the same breath, you are seeing when we have Google and Starbucks and Amazon along, which we only did because we were looking into HMRC as part of our standard inquiries that we do once every 12 months, and we discovered that they had made mistakes that had let Goldman Sachs off the hook in a completely different tax case, and then had, as it were, tried to cover up the extent to which they'd made mistakes. And it came out gradually as we were dragging it out. And then we got into the broader issue of tax avoidance, because there were so many, so deeply contrived schemes that while they might be strictly within the letter of the law, if you went through the second tier tax tribunal and then to the Court of Appeal and then finally got a decision in your favour in the Supreme Court, if it went that far, were turning on the interpretations. I mean, generally speaking, cases don't go to the higher courts unless there are two very good cases, because if it's very clear one way or the other, then it's decided. But where it's turning literally is on a cigarette paper's thickness of interpretation. But so it might be lawful, although where classically one speaks of tax evasion that's unlawful and criminal, and that tax avoidance that's lawful. That's what I was brought up on. But actually, there's this grey area in the middle of what now is universally referred to as aggressive tax avoidance, using highly contrived schemes. The defining criterion being it is not meeting, or rather it's thwarting, the intention of Parliament, in the same breath almost as Whitehall permanent secretaries, you can see around the place if you're following the newspapers, saying this is becoming too much of a circus in the Public Accounts Committee. In the next sentence, there are senior ministers like the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Shadow Chancellor both talking about aggressive tax avoidance, and it's being on the agenda at the G8. And they can't both be true. So I think that the higher degree of publicity is important. I can see how many civil servants may find it very frustrating sometimes, because either because the hearing goes off at a tangent, or the questioner is not sufficiently well informed, or the only way they could adequately answer the question is to dump on their minister, because their minister took a really stupid decision. And there's always going to be a bit of tension around all of that. But and I would much prefer an adult conversation about how difficult it is to run government departments successfully and the various things we might do about it. But very often you don't get that, because most permanent secretaries don't have the chutzpah and the confidence that Richard Mottram had, and that Mark Sedwill quite plainly has, the new Perm Sec at the Home Office, to engage in the right way. And when you get that kind of engagement, it's much more constructive all round.
Okay. I'd just like to say one thing before we close. You can, of course, watch the Public Accounts Committee or any other committee, and indeed the House itself, on Parliament TV, for those of you who don't have enough to do. And it's a great way to catch up on hearings. Not only the very high, most of the PAC's hearings are quite sparky actually, but some are very sparky indeed. And you can follow them either live or afterwards on Parliament TV. And it's once you find your way around the website, which, you know, if anybody's watching this Parliament TV, needs some improvement. But other than that, it's great to watch. Anyway, right. Anyway, I'd just like to thank Richard for coming this week and last. And MPs have a gazillion things to do, as you can see from this excellent website with its very helpful reading list. So thank you for that. And I'd like to thank you very much for coming both last week and this week. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.